getting straight to it, this is going to be a really enjoyable conversation, and we're going to talk about culture and the influence of religion on culture and politics and much else besides. It's really the sweet spot of what we do here at the Patrick Coffin Show. And speaking of which, if you're interested in connecting dots that are hiding in plain sight, if you like exposing false media narratives, if you want to see the big picture of how we got here, say from 1965 onward, you might want to check out True North. The True North movement is found inside my website. It's patrickcoffin.media. We have people in multiple countries having critical conversations and finishing each other's sentences. So check out the True North movement inside patrickcoffin.media. My guest this episode of the show is Professor Eric Kaufmann. He is a professor of politics at the University of Buckingham in the UK. He's an author. His many fine books include White Shift, The Third Awakening, published in England as Taboo, How Making Race Sacred Produced a Cultural Revolution, and The Four Virtues of a Leader. He's also an expert in Orangeism. Eric Kaufmann, so great to talk to you.
Good to be here, Patrick.
I live in Orange County, and there's a lot of orange. I know it's the county's named after the fruit, but there seems to be a lot of Orangemen, sort of quasi-Masonic lodges around. Every time I see the word orange, I just hear the phrase, "You Fenian bastards, you!"
Yeah.
Growing up in Canada, it's just one of those things you pick up.
Yeah.
Maybe we can start there. Why the interest in the Orange Order and the strife of Northern Ireland? It seems random.
Well, yeah, I think just as a Canadian interested in Canadian history, and then, how many Canadians know that, there have been 4 Orange prime ministers, including Sir John A. Macdonald, the first kind of founding father, if you like, of the country. And then, they ran in the city of Toronto from the 1870s to the 1950s. None of those things are really known. So that kind of intrigued me, and I wanted to find out more. And I was in Britain. And I thought, well, let's go see it in a place where it's still alive in a way, or at least a powerful force, which was Belfast at the top, but Northern Ireland. And that sort of got me interested. And then you get into the whole labyrinth of Northern Ireland politics. And I first went there in about 99, so about a year after the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement was signed. Mm-hmm. And it was still pretty fresh in terms of, the armored cars driving around, the peace walls. The Orange Lodge headquarters had car parts from a bomb that was in front of their head. So there's really quite a sense of the conflict at the time.
Now, even to this day, there are tensions there. If there's sections of like Catholic minority enclave, the Orange Parade will go past, and there's still some tension to this day, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And it's still a very segregated society. The Protestants and Catholics living in separate areas, obviously separate churches, but separate schools, separate sports, almost everything separate. Not entirely, but the mixing is only in certain ways, at work, in certain public areas, but then they go back after dark to their own areas.
Do you think the tensions in Ireland are kind of a concentrated orange juice version of the tensions in most countries? It's just it comes to a head there.
Yes, in a way. I mean, you've obviously had a history of violence, various episodes going back to the 1600s, and history lives there in a way it doesn't as much in other Western countries, and that includes, more so than in Ireland or Scotland, which would be the most proximal parts of Britain and Ireland. So that's the amazing thing, is it's very modern on the surface, but then history is alive for a lot of people in a way it isn't in most Western countries.
How did you become interested in the kind of nexus or overlap between religion and culture in your sociological studies, and how did that become your sweet spot?
Well, I guess, if you go back to my PhD and early work, master's work, I'm interested in the issue of population shifts through immigration and ethnic change on the one hand, and national identity and identities, particularly of ethnic majority groups, to those changes. And that was kind of the basis for my early interest. Now, what happens is I then kind of go into and of course, religion was the key marker. If we're talking about the 19th century, it was mainly about Protestant and Catholic, whether in the U.S. or in Canada, or in Britain with the Irish. So that was the kind of main axis, whereas it's only in the second half of the 20th century race becomes a bigger issue. as the Catholic Protestant thing fades. And so that was kind of one interest. Now, the book that I did on birth rates and family size in relation to religion was somewhat of a new departure because I was interested in population and how it affects politics. I'd looked at how ethnic population shifting. So Northern Ireland is a classic case of where when it was formed, it was designed as a Protestant majority, two-thirds Protestant statelet. The Catholics have increased to around 50-50 now, and that increases the backdrop to all of the troubles in a very roundabout way, and it's a lot to explain. But so there's a lot of interest in these ethnic shifts and how they lead to various kinds of conflict. And I was just interested then in looking at conflict within religions, say within Protestantism, within Judaism, between call it fundamentalists and moderates, or even seculars. And that was the basis of the book Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, because I was spotting these big birth rate gaps between very strong fundamentalist religious groups and the secular population, whose birth rates really were going down. And really since that book, which came out in, I think, 2010, 2011, these trends have only deepened.
That's around the same time my first book came out, first titled Sex au Naturel. Now it's called The Contraception Deception. And I have a lot of myth busting there about the role that the contraceptive mentality has had on people everywhere in the world. In 1960, as you probably know, the first birth control pill, Enovid, was approved by the FDA. And nowadays, this is something you pointed out. The more religious a Jew you are, or more practicing a Muslim you are, or obviously engaged practicing Catholic as I am, the more likely you're going to see fertility as a gift, and you're going to want to maximize your progeny. You want to, kind of be fruitful and multiply more seriously. Is that the demarcation, the more faithfulness to the principles of what we call Abrahamic religions, that's correlated in some way with family size?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the iron law of demography used to be basically that, and at a time when, for much of the past few centuries, I mean, the concern was high birth rates and overpopulation. And so what you saw was that women's education seemed to be correlated with lower birth rates. Now, that's true in the African continent. It's not true really for the developed world, for Asia, East Asia and the West. That doesn't make much difference anymore. What does make the difference in the developed countries is religiosity. And that's the strongest predictor of family size now. And I think increasingly so. So I think, and I was interested in that. And just what does this mean, right? I mean, if you have the average number of children per woman for people who say they have no religion, if that's around 1, and people who are practicing religious of the Abrahamic faiths, if it's around 2, then, obviously mathematically what we know in terms of population projections is fertility rate differences are the most important factor in the long run, in the period of centuries. In the short run, switching behavior is more important. If we're talking about 20 years from now, 30 years from now, but if we're talking about 100 years or 200 years, it's the birth rate differences that really are the key. So we have to start thinking about what the world is going to look like with these demographic dynamics. And that was the basis of my book, really.
Well, it turns out Malthus was wrong. The human ingenuity was not really accounted for in the way we produce food. We're not starving to death. You think of the Paul Ehrlich alarmist book, The Population Bomb, that came out the same year that Humanae Vitae did. He said that, I think the opening sentence for that book is, in 2000, millions now living will be dead, or something like that. Kind of hysteria about this explosion of population. It seems like if we keep having under 2 kids, and in many countries 1, we're in demographic trouble, because you have to at least replace yourself and then accommodate for infant mortality. What countries do you see as in heading toward demographic nuclear winter? I'm thinking of places like Japan.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you go around the world, the real fertility deserts would be, East Asia, like coastal China, Hong Kong, Korea, Japan, probably Korea would be the worst, Taiwan, those sorts of places. Japan would be only slightly better. But then in Europe, you've got a lot of, the Germanic world has really low fertility. Eastern Europe, especially places like, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states, very low fertility. Southern Europe, Spain, Portugal, Italy, very low fertility. So, maybe formerly Catholic countries to some extent. And even the places that were at the upper end of the distribution, the Anglo-Saxon countries, including Ireland, the Nordic countries, a lot of them have gone down considerably in the last 10 years, actually. Now, and there's some speculation that this is ideological as well. Nordic countries have not been very religious for a long time, but perhaps left-wing ideology is playing a role in feminism, is playing a role perhaps in these societies, these very liberal societies that have had historically, Britain's fertility it's gone from around replacement to 1.55 in the span of about 10 years, very quick, and seems to be falling like a stone. So it's very hard to find, France is probably the best performing on these measures. It's like probably 1.8, 1.9. And that's pretty stable. But a lot of other European countries, and now go to North America, Canada, 1.25, 1.3, really very low. It's dropped a lot. US has gone down. It's still much, still probably around, 1.7 or something, maybe 1.6. But, which is not going to drop rapidly the way the Southern Europe is, but it's verging on something that might become a bit of a free fall. The point I make, though, in the book, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, is this is kind of a demographic or evolutionary bottleneck, right? So it's a bit like whoever has had the gene to survive the Black Death made it through that bottleneck, and everyone in the world today has that adaptation. So the question is, if we're going through one of these bottlenecks, who is going to be around? Right, will be the people who have the adaptation. Now, it could be that they're strongly religious. That's the adaptation. It could be they have some gene for liking children or liking large families. One or other of those adaptations, one way or the other, that's who's going to be around. Now, of course, we could have a cultural shift. It doesn't look like it, but it's possible. But other than that, I would say maybe we're heading into some kind of evolutionary bottleneck.
Is the DEI ideology a synonym for communist infiltration? What's the relationship between the communist impulse that still exists in China and North Korea, to a certain lesser extent, right. Venezuela? Is this a tool of the commies?
Yes and no. I'd say it does. Woke. So let me define woke for you first. Woke is the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. That's what woke is, out of which comes a belief system that says we have to have equal outcomes by race, by sex. We can't have any race gaps or gender gaps in terms of pay, in terms of wealth or whatever. So we have to correct them through quotas, through an affirmative action program. So Harvard, 13% of the U.S. is black, so they have to have 13% black students. They have to discriminate against whites and Asians to get there. That's called equity. Okay, so that's one part of this belief system. The other part is what's called inclusion. So the diversity, equity, inclusion. DE means discriminating to get equal outcomes. I is inclusion. That means we have to censor your speech, so you're not going to offend even the most sensitive member of one of these sacred groups. So that is really where, if you hold a debate about, is a trans woman a woman? Well, that's triggering for a very thin-skinned member of a marginalized group. So you can't hold that debate. So we're gonna no platform you, right? So that inclusion side is really about censorship. That's this DEI ideology. Part of its roots are communist, in the sense of, radical people who wanted to overthrow capitalism and the society. They lost faith in the working class, and they turned to the new third world proletariat that was throwing off the colonial yoke, and they turned to urban ethnic minorities, and then later to women and LGBT. And so this is partly a march through the institutions, and this is sort of the theme of Chris Rufo's book. But in my book, which is entitled The Third Awakening in the US and Canada, I argue actually that I think the left liberals have more power in explaining how we got here, how woke becomes the dominant ideologies, more so than the Marxists, more so than the people that want to tear down society and throw out capitalism, and wasn't the main motive. So if you take the left liberals, what they're all about is a certain degree of this harm protection. Like, we need to protect vulnerable groups from harm, and that includes emotional harm. So we need, we don't want them to be experiencing so-called emotional traumas. The meaning of the word trauma is stretched out to mean all kinds of things. So a raised eyebrow to a person of color, if that's perceived as a trauma, and then it's traumatic, it reminds them of, Jim Crow or whatever. And so the idea here is that this is actually a very therapeutic humanistic psychotherapy, which comes out in the 60s. People like Carl Rogers, and that eventually creeps, and the meaning of these therapeutic terms like bullying and prejudice and trauma and safety just kind of expands outward. And so we get into this ridiculous position where we're talking about trigger warnings and microaggressions, and it's this very kind of victimhood based culture. And that's where I think a lot of the power, and certainly if you look at the people who are protesting and yelling and screaming, this is all about them thinking that they've had some grievous wound because of somebody's word. Words are violence. And so I think this is really a lot of this then is not necessarily out of Marxism, but it's out of this very kind of humanistic liberal progressivism, which is kind of this left liberalism. And that's why I think, why did a majority of Seattle voters support defund the police? Do they really want to overthrow capitalism and throw out the society? I don't actually think that's it. I just think they thought that's the nice thing. It's really nice to marginalize groups, to sort of defund the police. And that's, I think, what's driving this kind of bleeding heart liberalism.
A lot of the content of my commentaries and interview guests and all the things I do on YouTube have to be heavily censored by me. To get the full iteration, unfiltered, uncensored, go to the True North Movement. That's patrickcoffin.media. You'll find an extra episode. You'll find all the activities around the water cooler, our main community chat. We do books, we do movies, we do culture, faith, and reason. So get the entire conversation, uncensored from YouTube. Go to patrickcoffin.media.